Thanks. It's great to be with you this morning. When I saw Dan here and he introduced himself, it's kind of like, I wanted to talk a little bit about legacy and, what do we sow? And when you think about it, this is kind of like Dan's legacy today. A son-in-law, a family. He was my high school teacher. He was an elder in my church, and part of the staff at Holland Christian. But this is, I think, what are we leaving for future generations? What will they say about the work that we've done? I think about that a lot. West Michigan has invested a lot in me. I had the opportunity to go to school here, Holland Christian, Hope College, worked at Herman Miller. You sent me to Congress for 18 years. Then I had the opportunity, Diane and I had the opportunity to go to the Netherlands for 3 years. People ask me, what do you do now? And I work for a think tank, and they say, hallelujah. He finally has a job where he has to think. All right? He's worked for us for so long, he's never had to think, but now he does. But Diane and I have been so benefited by the many opportunities, unique opportunities that we have had to learn and to serve, and so many of you are a part of that. But what's the legacy? And Bob, he and I, earlier this year I was working on something, and I said I need to learn more about China. And they said, and what's going on in China? They said, hey, here's a guy you got to call. You got to call Bob Fu. And so we started a great relationship. You read the book, and it's like, wow, look at what he's gone through compared to, for most of us, we've had much more comfortable lives than what Bob and others and some of the examples that he's given you about what's happening in China. So I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, so I've got 3 points today. All right. I want to talk a little bit about, the cost of freedom and the legacy there. What's going on in China, the legacy that is there, and then what we as people of faith, individually and collectively through our churches, what legacy will we leave? So let me start. A friend of ours, Tom Rice, you may have heard of him in the last couple of days. Tom Rice was 101 years old and just recently died. 3 years ago, Diane and I had the opportunity to meet Tom in the Netherlands. He was a paratrooper in the 101st. He parachuted on D-Day. I think he parachuted into Africa or some other place before that. And then he parachuted into the Netherlands for Operation Market Garden, which is made famous because of the story of Bridge Too Far. So on the 75th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, Tom and I had the unique opportunity. We both jumped out of a perfectly good plane and parachuted in commemoration of Operation Market Garden. Now, he's 98, right? And he's jumping out of this plane, and we jump tandem. What does that mean? It means that you're strapped onto the chest of someone else, and I'm strapped onto the chest of a 6'6", 6'8" Dutch guy, because they don't make him any smaller than that over there. And we get to the back of the plane, and he says, Pete, bend your knees up. And I say to him, no, if I do that, then I'll be on the floor. And he says, no, you'll be just fine. So you bend up your knees and you don't move. He's just holding you. And then he jumps. We get to the ground, and I land fairly close to Tom. And Tom's, the reporters are all there, and, I'm not translating, but Tom's hearing isn't all that good. So I'm telling them what they're asking. And they say, Tom, what was different today? He says, well, they weren't shooting at me today. One of our favorite places, like I said, he just passed. His goal and objective was that he wanted to come back this year in September and jump again because he would have been 101, and he was a member of the 101st. He made it to 101. He didn't make it to jump again. I don't know if it was a health reason or whatever, but the reason that we were told is because somehow the American and Dutch governments couldn't figure out how to get him through Schiphol. If you've been watching the news, you know that Schiphol has moved from one of the most efficient airports to one of the worst airports in Europe, and you have to stand in line sometimes for 3 or 4 hours. And I can't tell you how heartbroken I was because he was a most wonderful guy. Another place in the Netherlands that we loved was Margraten. Maybe some of you have visited Margraten. It's the American cemetery. Roughly 10,000 Americans commemorated there, buried there, or on the wall of the missing for their, from World War II and the sacrifices that they made. The legacy is every one of those graves is adopted by a Dutch family. And there is a waiting list for families to adopt American graves. So we're there on Memorial Day, and we're greeting and we're telling the Dutch, thank you for coming, because they come to our Memorial Day service, and they put flowers on the graves. And they said, oh no, thank you for what you guys did, for what these people did. And they come with 4 generations, great-grandma, grandparents, parents, and little 4 or 5-year-old kids. These folks left a legacy to the Dutch, and the Dutch have remembered. They are phenomenal in remembering the sacrifices that we've made. But their legacy is the recognition that freedom isn't free, that they live in freedom today because America and others were willing to send our young men and women over there to free them. And they haven't forgotten. So freedom isn't free, and you have to earn it each and every day. In China today, there's the examples that Bob gave, but there are millions of examples. But the thing that I would caution you to, when you think about China, it's hard to do. Don't look at them through Western eyes. How can this be going on? People don't do this to other people. As Bob said, we don't know how many people died under communist rule in China under Mao. Is it 40? Is it 50? Is it 60? But the communist system, if you go to and look and study communism in Russia, North Korea, and China, it's estimated that the communist system has killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million of its own people since the 40s. Think about it. Of their own people, 100 million. This is the system that you have to think about that we're dealing with when you're talking about China. It's not just that they're persecuting Christians. They are systematically putting in place programs in that are designed to wipe out, any type of dissent, whether it's the Uyghurs, whether it's the Christians, whether it's, democracy movements and those types of things. And you've got the examples that Bob gave. There's another example. There's an 85-year-old, or in 1980, 5 years ago, 2017, Cardinal Zen visits the Trump administration to talk about what human rights and what's going on in China. He's 85 years old, and I know the person that he met with in the State Department, and she says one of the profound statements was, I think I'm going to die in jail because of my belief. And he's been persecuted, his whole professional career. Today, he is in jail. He's 90 years old because he was advocating for freedom, democracy, in Hong Kong. And like these other examples, he will be convicted through the courts, most likely, and will be given a sentence, which means that ultimately he probably will die in jail. But you also have to think about the larger context of, you can think about the legacy that Cardinal Zen and these other people will leave. What a phenomenal persecution that they have put up with, and they've stayed strong in the faith. But again, if you're looking at the Chinese communist system, and this is, I'm not always as good at it as what I want to be, but we try to always make a fundamental distinction between the Chinese Communist Party, which is a small part of China, and the people of China. We believe the people of China, they're like us. They're created in the image of God inherently. They are going to be good people and all that, but they are governed by a terrible system. We are not in conflict with the people of China. We are in conflict with a totalitarian, authoritarian, evil system. And think about what the Chinese do, what the Chinese Communist Party does when they think that religion is a threat to them. We're all familiar with the one-child policy, right? It's not new. Families in China were restricted in saying you could have one child. By the way, if you got pregnant a second time, babies were aborted. An evil policy. What do they do today? I had the opportunity in the Netherlands to meet with the Uyghurs. They're a Muslim religion in China. They're undergoing genocide. Doesn't mean they're all being killed, but what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do is systemically wipe out that culture and that religion. And you're meeting with the Uyghurs, and they'll say, we have families that are members of our family that just vanish and disappear. In a year, 3, 5 years later, we still have no idea what has happened to our family members. In China, what's one of China's growing businesses? One of China's growing businesses, we have a friend who may need a new kidney. If he wanted to schedule a kidney transplant, you could do it with China. And you can schedule a kidney transplant. You say, well, how do you do that? Well, you have two, and sometimes they do, and one person shares it with someone else. But in China, you can schedule it because they have bodies, not humans, but living bodies, because they don't view them as humans, that are available for organ transplants. It's part of their business model. Okay, organ harvesting. Think about the evil of organ harvesting. It's alive. They would view it as this is a live body. We happen to have someone who needs part of that body for a transplant, so we will harvest the organ. The recipient will move on, and the donor will be dead. This is the kind of regime and the kind of thinking that you have going on in China today. The Uyghurs suffer through slave labor. Think about that. It's American companies. It's so frustrating. You hear that an American iconic company, as Bob pointed out, Apple, will submit to the threats of China and pull their Bible apps. what does that say about America? What does that say about Apple and their values? It means their values are more about the bottom line than adhering to any, to any higher good. Okay? Well, we can't jeopardize our market in China. One that I've spent a lot of time on, wrote a book on, is COVID. There are still debates about where it came from, but originally it was, all of mainstream media, the medical establishment and all that said, it developed naturally. Now 2 years later, most people, or there's a growing consensus, or at least a significant debate, saying, no, this probably came out of the Wuhan lab. And it's kind of like, that's what my book that I wrote with some other folks says. A high probability that this came out of the Wuhan lab. And if you disagree with that conclusion, that's fine. But the thing that nobody disputes is that once China found out that there was a deadly virus that had been unleashed in Wuhan, regardless of how it developed, what the Chinese did is they facilitated the spread of that virus around the world. They locked down Wuhan, but they put people on airplanes and sent them all around the world who they probably had they had the knowledge and knowing that there's a high probability these people had the virus and then we're going to just spread it. The end result is we've had 7 million people die around the world because of the actions by the Chinese government, a country that does not value human life. So when you're thinking about Christians being persecuted in China, and you say, well, how can they take the cross off of a church? How can they imprison all of these folks? Put it in the collective that this is how this society works and this is how this government works. And that the values that they have are so different than the values that we have from the West. And if you wake up in the morning and you recognize the evil of the Chinese regime, you will get a better understanding of the threats and the life that Christians in China face each and every day when they wake up. It is an evil regime that sees, Bob, you had some great pictures, the one of the cross with the two leaders next to each other, because why? They see religion as a threat. They want to usurp religion and put the Chinese Communist Party, mark on religion so that they can use the power of religion to further their goals and objectives. So the legacy is, the Chinese, what they're doing. The challenge that we have is the third point is, how do we respond as Christians and how do we respond as a church? A couple of weeks ago, last week we had an election. A couple of weeks ago, Diane and I, we were at a church and they were having a rally where they were going to be talking about a number of, they were talking about political candidates, introducing political candidates, but they were also talking about Proposition 3. And Proposition 3 in Michigan was one that basically has now legalized infanticide. Recognize that we have in our Constitution in the state of Michigan an abortion policy which is the equivalent of what they have in China and North Korea. And as we were before, there were a group of us that we were meeting with the pastor beforehand. And the third person I wanted to introduce to you is Mr. Anonymous. And as we were talking about this, and the pastor there was telling us about what they were doing in terms of fighting Proposition 3. And Mr. Anonymous said, well, in our church, we've talked with our pastor, and they've said they're not going to bring it up. And someone else said, why would you even belong to a church that wouldn't bring that up? And Mr. Anonymous said, that's a great question. If they're not willing to talk about a fundamental issue like that. And so, the challenge I think that we have now is, how do we talk about that issue, it's a very sensitive issue, absolutely. Speaking about China persecution and those types of things, the challenge that we have is, how do we collectively, individually and collectively, what do we do individually, but what will we do as a church to start addressing these evils, whether they're in our country or whether they are global? There's an interesting, where do you think most of the Bibles in the world are printed today? What's that? No. More than 50% of the Bibles in the world today are printed in China. If you go to a bookstore and you take a look at Christian books for kids, we went to buy some books for our grandkids for their birthday. Diane opened them up, printed in China. Amity Printing Company. They just celebrated the printing of their 200 millionth Bible. China. And you go through there, and then you see they've opened another printing facility in Ethiopia. And then it says, consistent with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And you kind of say, wow. Supposedly a Christian publishing house is forwarding the agenda of China, the Belt and Road Initiative. I can't get into everything what it is, but basically it's an economic program to advance the authoritarian and totalitarian regime of the Chinese Communist Party throughout the world, with targeting countries that need economic development, but they see that coming from China as a way to move it forward, to move their agenda forward. And they're being helped by Christian companies, or so-called Christian companies. They're being helped by American businesses. Every time that they make a dollar, it goes to the Chinese Communist Party. Early next year, I expect the state of Michigan is going to provide $800 million of assistance in different forms to a Chinese battery company to open a plant in the state of Michigan. And you sit there and say, wow. And those economic benefits from China, that China will get from that, will be used to forward their agenda of the persecuted church. So, we need to become more engaged, because someday, if we don't stop this, people will ask, Dad, Grandpa, what did you do? They'll go to our religious leaders and say, what did you do? It's our job to help the folks in China. It's also our job to, I think, put pressure on our leaders, whether they're in the religious area, the political area, or whatever, to confront these evils before they are spread. We know they're evil. This is not a secret. Okay? This is not a secret. But you don't hear us addressing it. And that is a challenge that we face. So, they're tough. There's nothing easy about this. But it wasn't easy for Tom Rice and his buddies. It wasn't easy, and it isn't easy for Cardinal Zen. And we shouldn't take the easy way out either. So, hey, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.